everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of Learning to Paint with Ms. Blair. Hopefully in front of you, you have the tools that I asked you to remember to bring last class. To get set up for today's tutorial, you are going to need 5 things. Number 1, you need the base of your yogurt container filled with about 2 inches of water. Number 2, you need the lid of the yogurt container, which we are going to use as a palette. Number 3, you need a square of paper towel for when we are switching colors with your brushes. Number 4, you need your sketchbook. And number 5, of course, you need your brushes. I'm going to give you a moment right now to get set up with these 5 things. I want you to clear everything else off and under your desk so that you're neatly set up for today's tutorial. We're going to pause the video here and you can go ahead and do that. Okay, so now we're on to step 2 of getting set up. In front of you, you should have a color printout of your reference image. From that color printout, I would like you to draw 2 squares that are about 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, and cut those out and tape them into your sketchbook. Beside them, I would like you to draw 2 squares of exactly the same size. Very much like we did when we were looking at your drawing assignment, we are going to choose small areas that appear challenging in the image and practice how to paint those textures. I'm going to give you a moment to select and cut out the 2 squares from your reference photograph and then tape those into your sketchbook, and beside them draw 2 matching squares that we are actually going to use for our practice layering tutorial. So now that we're all set up, we have our materials in front of us, we have our practice squares cut out and taped into our sketchbooks, we are ready to get started. Students sometimes find the idea of approaching a painting very intimidating. But the process that we're going to follow is actually a really simple 2-step procedure. The very first step is going to be identifying what color you should use for a base layer in your image. A base layer is where you look at the subject that you're painting and try to identify the mid-tone of that subject. So, for instance, if you are painting a tiger, like in the example you see here, you would look at the fur texture and ask yourself, what is a good medium tone here? And you would paint all of the areas of orange fur solidly with that medium tone. Likewise, here in the example of this otter, the artist has looked at the mid-tone colors and brushed them on loosely. In areas where the mid-tone changes from one color to another, you want to make sure that you don't have a solid edge, but instead you have more of a loose, brushy edge. It's not like a paint by numbers approach where you're mapping out these different territories necessarily, but instead they're going to blend together, especially if you've chosen a subject that is more organic. So the very first thing I want you to do is look at your first practice square and ask yourself, what color should I use as a base layer? There is one other point of consideration in choosing your base layer color. It is possible with acrylic paint to paint light over dark. Here in the example of Allie's lion, which she painted last year, she started with a very dark base layer, close to black. and then over top added her detail in brighter tones. Likewise, last year with Gemma's wolf, she started with a really dark black brown and added the details over top in a cream color. So it's going to be very dependent on your image, and you're going to have to use your inferencing skills here to critically look at the photograph and think, what would be the underlying tone here before I paint the detail, adding highlights and lowlights on top. So I'm going to give you a moment here. I want you to look at your image, talk to your partner beside you, and identify what color you should use. Okay, you can pause the video here and have your conversation. Now that you have decided on your base layer color, we have one more theory practice before we actually get into painting. Once you have your base layers down, what you're going to do is work on adding the detail. As I mentioned before, you're going to layer the detail over top with the highlights and lowlights. I'm going to start with a step-by-step example here of the tiger that I referenced before. Notice the base layer is this darker orange color. And over top, they've actually taken that orange and added white to it to make it a much lighter, brighter, yellowish orange tone. And over top of the base layer, using a very fine detail brush, they brush in a fur texture. Now, when painting fur, you're going to pay really close attention to the length and directionality of the fur, noticing that it's not all the same direction. It's much shorter, tiny little brush strokes in the nose area, and then as the hair grows out towards the edges of the face, it becomes longer and much more coarse. Regardless of what kind of subject you're painting, this is very important, looking closely and observing the details and the shapes of the highlight and lowlight. Up next, I have a time lapse for you of a different subject. We can look at a leaf here and how after starting with a base layer of green, the artist then adds the highlights and lowlights using that same painting technique with lighter and darker greens. Let's play the clip. All right, so now it is time to apply this theory to your own image. I want you to again look at the photograph from your practice square in your sketchbook and ask yourself, what colors are you going to need to add the highlights and lowlights, the textural details over top of the base layer, and have that shopping list of colors in your mind. This is going to be very different per person depending on the subject that you're trying to paint. And this is something that I'm going to let you decide on your own, using your own critical thinking to plan out your colors. Now, depending on the painting style that you're going with, it may not actually be the colors from the image. For instance, I have one person doing a Da Vinci style painting, and the entire image is going to be in beige and brown tones, even though the photograph has many more colors in it. So if you're that person, you would just choose the beige and brown tones in the style that you're choosing. Likewise, if you're going something Pablo Picasso, you may be choosing more brighter tones and a broader range of color. So with that in mind, it's time to actually go and get our paint and to try this out. Now, here's what you need to know about getting your paint. This is very important. We have amazing high quality materials in this class. Each jar of paint is very expensive. It is professional artist quality paint. So there are two things you need to remember when you go to get the paint. Number one, it's really, really important that you do not cross-contaminate the paints. If you take a palette knife and take some green paint, add it to your palette. Do not use that same dirty green knife to then plunge it into the yellow and contaminate the yellow with your green. Because as we know, when paint mixes together, it changes the color and it will compromise the color of the entire container. These are very expensive. They can be up to $50 a container, and it's a huge waste if you're not careful and you do contaminate it. So please be incredibly conscious of this. Point number two, the paint goes much farther than you think it will, because when you're painting, you're probably not going to directly just use the paint, but you want to wet your brush and have a nice wet brush where you mix the water in with it a little bit so that it goes farther on your paper. So with that in mind, when you're getting your paint, you only need about a pinky finger size dab of paint on your palette. If that dab of paint is bigger than a fingernail and it's this giant glob, that's also a major waste of paint, especially considering right now we're only doing these tiny square samples. So please be very conservative when taking your paint colors. It should just be the size of a fingernail. At this time, I'm going to let you go and get your paint. You can pause the video here.